Fairy tales are some of the most enduring and adaptable stories in human history. From the dark and violent folk stories of centuries past to the colorful, sanitized versions we see today, these tales have evolved significantly. In this video, we'll explore how fairy tales have changed over time, reflecting shifting cultural values and societal norms. The origins of fairy tales are much darker than the Disney versions most of us grew up with. Early fairy tales were primarily oral folk stories, passed down through generations to teach children moral lessons and warn them about the dangers of the world. The Brothers Grimm, for instance, collected many of these stories in the 19th century. But their versions of famous tales like Cinderella and Snow White were far from the happily ever afters we know today. In their version of Cinderella, for example, the evil stepsisters cut off parts of their feet to try and fit into the glass slipper. These stories were filled with violence, death, and consequences, reflecting the harsh realities of life in the past. As fairy tales became more popular, they were adapted to suit the tastes of middle-class audiences. Charles Perrault, a French author in the 17th century, played a significant role in this transformation. He softened stories like Sleeping Beauty and Little Red Riding Hood, adding clear moral lessons while removing some of the more gruesome elements. Even the Brothers Grimm, who initially collected raw, unedited versions of folktales, later revised their stories to make them more suitable for children. Though still dark, the stories became less violent and more focused on the triumph of good over evil. Perhaps the most significant transformation came in the 20th century with Disney's adaptations. Disney took tales like Snow White, Cinderella, and Sleeping Beauty and turned them into colorful, family-friendly narratives that focused on romance, magic, and happy endings. Gone were the violent punishments for villains and the grim realities of earlier versions. Instead, Disney's versions promoted ideals of true love, perseverance, and the eventual triumph of good. These adaptations became so popular that Disney's versions of fairy tales became the definitive ones in modern culture, overshadowing the darker, original stories. In recent years, we've seen a resurgence of interest in revisiting and reimagining traditional fairy tales. Modern authors and filmmakers are often drawn to the original dark roots of these stories, using them to explore new themes or subvert traditional narratives. Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber, for example, reimagines classic fairy tales from a feminist perspective, giving more agency to female characters. Movies like Maleficent take traditionally villainous characters and portray them with more depth, exploring the motivations behind their actions. These modern retellings challenge the sanitized versions we grew up with and bring complexity back to these ancient stories. It's also important to note that fairy tales aren't just a European tradition. Cultures around the world have their own versions of these timeless stories. For example, the Chinese tale of Mulan or the stories from the Arabian Nights have also undergone significant transformation as they've been adapted for global audiences. These stories offer a different perspective but share the same core purpose: to teach lessons, entertain, and reflect societal values. Interestingly, fairy tales today are experiencing a return to the darker roots. Shows like Once Upon a Time or films like Pan's Labyrinth embrace the complexity and grimness of original folk tales, delving into psychological themes and moral ambiguity. These modern interpretations reflect a desire to explore deeper human experiences, moving away from the simple good versus evil dichotomy popularized by Disney. The evolution of fairy tales shows us how stories can change over time to reflect the values, fears, and desires of different societies. From the dark beginnings as cautionary tales to their colorful Disney adaptations and now back to more nuanced retellings, fairy tales have proven their adaptability and timeless appeal. Whether we prefer the grim morality of the Brothers Grimm or the magic of Disney, these stories continue to captivate us, showing that fairy tales are as relevant today as they were centuries ago.